It really comes down to the difference between AI versus non-AI. And what I mean is for regular data center, that power consumption is basically stable or flat throughout the years. Versus for AI data center, that power consumption can really go from 1 to 100 and back to 1. And all of that can happen within 1 second during training. If you actually talk to people inside of OpenAI, they will tell you, oh, they actually call AGI as something that will have a slow takeoff, meaning that it's actually more progressive than all of a sudden. And I think Zuckerberg also said it in one of his interviews really well. He said, oh, AGI is not just this one thing because there's no single threshold for humanity because people can have very different skills. So it's really like over time, it's more incrementally that we just add different capabilities to it. For something like translation, maybe, we probably already hit AGI even today.
Welcome to Autopilot, a podcast where we discuss the past, present, and future of AI and automation.
From Atlanta, Fulton County.
That's one small step for man.
We explore how AI is creating and disrupting large industries in conversations with top founders, investors, and historians. I'm your host, Will Summerlin. Let's dive in. Freda, thank you for joining us on the Autopilot podcast. I'm very excited for this episode. You're probably one of the most thoughtful and research-driven AI investors I know. So we're going to talk about a bunch of interesting and complex topics today, from the energy side of AI to what AGI actually means and how far away we are, to models, open source versus closed source, and lots of other things. But before we jump into that, let's start with you. You're at a firm called Altimeter. I think most people probably know Altimeter, but for those that don't, can you start by just explaining what Altimeter is and what you do there, and then spend a minute on your background?
Right. So Altimeter is a crossover technology-focused investment firm. So basically, we do both VC and also public hedge fund. So I've been with Altimeter for 4 years and spent a lot of time recently thinking about some of the big questions in AI.
That's great. As we think about AI, we can just go ahead and jump in here. One of the big questions, speaking of big questions, that I think a lot of people are asking is really on the energy side. Like we've seen as scaling laws hold, the more compute you use to train models, the more data you use to train models, generally the better models perform across a wide range of tasks. But actually training these models and also running inference on these models takes a ton of power. And it seems like that's become one of the bottlenecks. Like people talk about GPUs being the bottleneck, and we've been supply constraint on GPUs, and it seems like maybe that's easing. We can talk about that a little bit, but it seems like energy will be the next bottleneck, and you can't just spin up power grids overnight. So I'm curious how you're thinking about that as a bottleneck.
Right. So first of all, I want to say it's actually not just energy, but really everything that's in and around the data center that has become the bottleneck. And those names have done really well in the stock market year to date. And so as an investor, I think it's very interesting to actually see the market has been following and tracking those bottlenecks. Last year, at one point, you also mentioned it, it's all about the data and the compute being the limiting factors. I think it was kind of around Q3 or Q4 last year. That's when the narrative really shifted. And I think two things contributed to it. One is that's roughly around the time when H100 were delivered to end customers. And number two, we had some kind of breakthrough in synthetic data that gave us some runway until call it 2025. And so people really pivoted and very quickly shifted the focus towards infrastructure and electricity. My mental framework on electricity is actually very simple. It's just the supply side, the demand side, and the grid that's connecting the two. And for both supply and demand, it's not just about the volume, but also really comes down to the type or the volatility profile of the supply and demand. So if we look into the demand side, the total power consumption in the US has been pretty flat at around 4,000 terawatt hours. Like 3% or 17 gigawatt of that is consumed by data centers. If you take NVIDIA's number as the input, then in just a few years, the total data center will consume closer to 100 gigawatt of power. And just to put things into perspective, a megacity like New York consumes about 15 gigawatt of power. So 100 gigawatt is definitely a very big number. But I think what the public don't really appreciate is that it's not just about the volume, but also the difference between AI versus non-AI data center. So training itself doesn't consume a crazy amount of power, but it really comes down to the difference between AI versus non-AI. And what I mean is for regular data center, that power consumption is basically stable or flat throughout the years. Versus for AI data center, that power consumption can really go from 1 to 100 and back to 1. And all of that can happen within 1 second during training. And it's just the way how neural network really works. And I think people don't really recognize that kind of volatility that's been added to the load.
Is all of the volatility on the training side, or is there also a lot of volatility on the inference side?
Yeah, like so far what I've been hearing is just like on the inference side, it's probably more controllable.
I guess the logical question then is like, if the two challenges are the grids that we have today can't
Right.
handle, the net increase and load demands, and also aren't built for the volatility, like how do we solve it, and how long is it going to take to solve it?
Right. So I think given the demand profile that we see, what you really need on the supply side is probably something that's highly dispatchable energy sources to basically match with demand on a real-time basis. But if you look at the supply side, we have call it 63 gigawatt of power that will come online in 2024. And 95% of that is solar or wind. And as we both know, like solar and wind are not the most controllable type of energy sources, and that has its own set of volatilities. So I think that's really creating a problem. And in terms of the solution, I'll say probably just no perfect solutions in the near term. We can talk about some of the longer term solutions, and which I think it really comes down to we have to see some major breakthrough in energy efficiency, either at the model level or at the chips level. And the other thing we will see in the long term is we need to have more nuclear power plants coming online. And in terms of the relative near term solution, one is I think we will see more co-location deals. And the other one just we will have more gas plants coming online. But even that will probably take 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, the cycle to actually build a new plant and get it certified and get it online is not something that can happen in a
Right.
matter of months,
Right.
um,
Exactly.
which is challenging because like you could build a data center in 6 months, and people are building data centers quickly. So there will be this like demand and supply imbalance, I think, at some point in the near future. I'm curious, as you think about this like regionally, um, it seems like a lot of the narrative has been the energy constraints, the grid in the United States.
Mhm.
Have you seen any of the hyperscalers or other data center companies looking at other sources of energy outside the United States where maybe the grids can support higher loads or higher volatility?
Yeah, I think we started to see some of that, but at the same time, like if you want to do training or inferencing, it probably also makes sense to be closer to the end customers. So that creates some kind of limiting factors. And the other thing is definitely also in terms of national security, whether that's a question on whether you can or should be building data centers outside of the United States. But for now, we are really seeing this, like all the hyperscalers are trying to figure out like where can actually put data centers within the United States, and then try to figure out the specific states, and within the state, try to find the region to actually put it.
Yeah. Is cooling also a bottleneck? Volatility probably creates some challenges around cooling, but also just like the size of the training clusters now and the amount of heat that's displaced. I would imagine cooling has also been a challenge.
Right. There has been a lot of things happening on the cooling side. There's used to be like air cooled, and right now it's moving towards like liquid cooling. And so there are a lot of like new technologies in terms of that. But if you really think about what that really comes down to, or the entry barrier of doing cooling, I would say it's somewhat maybe 5 or 6 out of 10, meaning that today is it a bottleneck? Definitely yes. But if you ask me in 2 years, we actually see a lot of startups and new companies getting into the field. So maybe in 2 years, because of supply and demand will naturally just rebalance each other. So right now it's a bottleneck, but my personal prediction is that maybe in 2 years that'll be solved. Versus for energy, I see that as more of a longer term kind of imbalance that needs like tens of billions of dollars. And we may or may not eventually get there.
One of the other things that I've seen is companies, particularly the startups, like try to build co-located data centers next to like natural gas mining operations and using like the flare off of the natural gas mines to power
Right.
generators to power the data
Right.
center. Is that also like a viable path, or is that just going to be too small scale for kind of a meaningful impact on the problem set?
Right. That's definitely one of the solution. In terms of co-location, people talk about two things. One is you either co-locate with the nuclear power plants or you co-locate with the gas plants. And I almost think about the gas plants as kind of a backup solution to the nuclear power plants. And what I mean is that there's only 22 gigawatt of nuclear power plants in the United States. And so each power plant is roughly around 1 to 2 gigawatt. So you only have like so much nuclear power plants that you can actually go after. But we have a lot of gas plants. So is it more ideal than nuclear? I want to say no, but there's just more supply of gas plants.
Got it. That makes sense. It's interesting. I was talking to somebody recently who worked for a big power company that was building a nuclear plant. This was years ago, and
Yeah.
they were building in an area that was totally flat, and they had it almost complete, and they needed like a cooling pond, right? So they could pump water into the reactor if something happened. And right when it was almost complete, the regulations changed that required the pump or the pool to be gravity fed, and they were in an area that was completely flat. So once they had invested billions of dollars and got this plant pretty much complete, they had to build an artificial mountain essentially in the middle of like a flat area to have like hundreds of feet of elevation to create a gravity fed
Right.
cooling system. So it's like
Right.
it's just such a complicated place to build. I think you're right. I think it'll be some period of time before nuclear becomes like viable at
Yeah.
scale to have like a meaningful impact on consumption.
Exactly.
Maybe we can switch to kind of the build out of GPUs and what you're seeing on that side. One of the bearish arguments I think we've all heard against AI, at least in the near term, is that it's been a super capex heavy endeavor, and
Oh,
like
for
big
sure.
tech companies,
Yeah.
hyperscalers, and even startups have spent a ton of money, building out data centers, lots of GPU capacity, spent a ton of money on researchers to train these great models. But it seems like hundreds of billions of dollars in capex spend has not resulted in hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue or profit. So I'm curious how you're
Right.
thinking about that, both
Right.
now and over the next 3 to 5 years.
Right. Very interesting question. If you look at the four big tech companies, I think combined together, they will spend over $200 billion in CapEx this year. And that's up 40 to 45% versus 2023. If you look at that as a percentage of revenue, then we are reaching 15% versus the long-term average has been 10%. So it is really like big tech, big spend. And just as reference, I was looking it up. I think the oil and gas companies combined together at the peak of their investment cycle, which happened around 2013, I think spent like $160 billion in total in capex. So in some way, the big tech companies today are even spending even more than the oil and gas companies at the peak. So that's a very fair question that everyone is trying to find an answer to, which is, what about the return? Where's the ROI? Where's the value creation? So I think about it in terms of the application layer and the infra layer. So if you look at the infra layer, so today, before we move into AI, we are spending $200 billion in total on public cloud. And within that, call it maybe $15 billion was spent on CPU. As we move to AI, the chips layer is becoming a lot more expensive. And you can actually see that from NVIDIA's numbers. The cloud layer is still there, right? But on top of the chips layer and the cloud layer, you now have one additional layer called the large language model. So I can easily see how the infra layer spend double, if not triple, in the age of AI. Then the question really becomes, what's going to happen to the application layer? There are really two possibilities. So either that layer will just be squeezed because the infra layer is just taking up more space. Or the other possibility is that the total pie is so much bigger, so the application layer can maintain the profit margin. like we just don't have enough data point today to really see, oh, which way is going to be the future. But if you put a gun to my head, I want to say it's definitely somewhere in the middle, but I tend to think it might be closer to the former one, which is the application layer getting squeezed a little bit. I'm sure you followed the most recent earnings, the most recent quarters. Said in another way, the Microsoft or the hyperscalers are really sucking the oxygen out of the room. The hyperscalers are very aggressively upselling their suite, whether it's Fabric or Data Factory. They want to provide this all-in-one solution to the customer. So customers no longer have to purchase the packaged software solutions like they used to do.
It seems like AI coding assistants and eventually AI coding agents will accelerate that cycle, right? To the extent you have the fundamental fundamental infrastructure components, and you can just piece them together with API calls. Like you can have one developer who has a really good AI coding agent sitting next to them, and they can build
Right.
pretty much any custom workflow software solution you need in your company. Like you don't need to pay Salesforce $100,000 a year for a pretty basic CRM when you can create a highly
Right.
customized CRM in a matter of a couple of
Right.
days with a competent
Right.
software developer and AI coding assistant.
Right. For sure. For sure. I think it's actually one thing for AI to really build an entire software. We may or may not see that, but that's definitely a 3 to 5 year thing. But today, I think we saw the API calls and everything, or the hyperscalers really willing to provide all the software tools to the customers. The customer no longer have to go to independent software vendors to actually do what they used to do. And if you think about it, it's not just the cloud providers, like even NVIDIA, for example. Apparently, even with all the revenue and profit margin, they're still not happy just being a GPU provider. They
Well, that's
also
their
want to
culture,
sell
right?
you.
That's their
Yeah.
culture.
So they also want to sell you the cloud solutions. They want to sell you the software solutions. And I think they disclose that they already have a few billions of dollars in revenue of their software solution. So I was like, well, just think about it, how many software company that will be to actually generate a few billions of revenue. So definitely a lot of moving pieces in the market.
That's insane. I feel like people don't know about the software side of their business, or at least haven't paid much attention to it. I'm curious, what does this mean for all of the independent, infrastructure software companies? Like, you see a lot of vector database companies and lots of, I mean, we name every category, but there are lots of categories that kind of sit somewhere between applications and the hyperscalers. Do you think they're going to have a tough, 5 years ahead as the hyperscalers continue to push up the stack?
I think that's what the public market is essentially telling you. Uh, I think it really, for now, we don't have a perfect answer to know, oh, is the hyperscalers going to be stronger or those independent infrastructure software company going to have an upper hand? But I think we'll probably see that over time. But right now, just don't have a perfect way to predict that.
We've also seen several large startups whose
Right.
core business is essentially acquiring GPUs and then renting those GPUs out, which is really what the hyperscalers do. But these companies have gotten access to GPUs in an environment where they're supply constrained. Do you think
Yeah.
that's a viable business model moving forward, or do you think we're going to get to a point where the supply constraints relieve to the point where the hyperscalers have plenty of capacity and you don't need to use those third party
Yeah.
providers?
Right. So definitely the supply demand dynamic is really important to actually make the prediction. And the other thing, I think NVIDIA is actually important enough to actually decide the face of a lot of those companies. Like in the case of maybe CoreWeave, they really have this special relationship with NVIDIA, and NVIDIA want them to be successful. NVIDIA want them to be a viable cloud solution.
And just on this point, while we're here, do you think the hyperscalers are going to try to directly compete with the foundation model providers like OpenAI, Anthropic, XAI? They've had this basically partnership model in the past, and maybe it's similar to the relationship between the hyperscalers and application companies where they're frenemies, and we've seen these strategic deals between Microsoft and OpenAI and Google Cloud and Anthropic. I'm curious, what that's going to look like in 3 to 5 years, whether or not the hyperscalers are going to look around and say, let's just build these models ourselves versus relying on a partner to do it.
I think in terms of building the models, like right now in terms of the training costs, we are already at roughly $1 billion. So the next version might be like $10 billion total training run. So very soon, I think we'll just run out of the long tail of model companies. So in terms of the relationship, it's like they definitely do not want one single model company to be like too powerful. They also want to keep their internal team, so they have some kind of lever when they are talking to those model companies. But in terms of whether the cloud companies will really be the one to have the best models internally, I think increasingly that's probably unlikely, given how capital intensive it is to actually train those models.
And since we're on this point, like, how do you think about open source versus closed source here on the at the model
Right.
layer?
Right. So, like, first of all, I want to clarify. I don't think people are calling it the right name. Like Llama or Mistral, those companies, they are open weight, but not really open source. So you are given the parameters of the model, but you are not really given the pre-training data set or the training secrets behind it. If you think about it, Android or Linux, those are true open source. In terms of open versus closed, I think the question people are really trying to get to is the model layer really getting commoditized because Llama 3 was getting really powerful? And I think about it in two ways. One is in terms of the model capability. I keep reminding myself that GPT-4 was actually released in March 2023, and it's been 16 months. And so far, we don't have any model, maybe other than Cloud 3, that really surpassed GPT-4's level. So from a model capability-wise, is it getting commoditized? I want to say no. And the other point is, if you go back to the technology or how the models are really built, um, I mean, Llama 3 is very impressive. It basically continued to train the model beyond an optimal point to basically change the efficient frontier of model training. But I always think about it in this way. If you give OpenAI or any other model company the same amount of GPU and resources, they can probably do the same, if not even better, versus Llama. So, what that really tells us is that nothing today has really deviated from the scaling law. And what does the scaling law tell us? It's just like bigger models are just better models. So far, with everything we've seen, I don't really think there's like a true risk of the model layer getting completely commoditized.
It seems like, as long as scaling laws continue to hold, um, these training cycles are going to get more and more expensive. And you really will need like massive economies of scale in order to make the underlying economics make sense, right? If you're spending $1 billion on a training cycle,
Right.
like you probably need to produce, at least two, three, $4 or $5 billion in profit off of that model in order for it to make any sense. And you're only going to do that if you have a large number of customers, which you're
Right.
only going to have if you have one of the best models. And so the sort of economy of scale dynamic will likely, to your point earlier, like result in kind of a winner take most like outcome here, where you have a
Hmm.
couple of companies that are able to acquire the resources to train best in the world models.
For sure.
Those state of the art models require more customers, generate more revenue, which gives them the resources to train the next generation of model. So it's
Yeah.
like a very clear logical path forward where you end up with, a couple of winners.
Yeah, exactly. And just to give you some numbers on that, so I think GPT-4 was trained on 8,000 H100 equivalent for about 100 days. The total training cost, if you do the math, is around like $300 million. And for GPT-5, I think the rumor was that that was trained on 30,000 H100 for about a few months. And the total training cost would be closer to $1 billion. And of course, you can say, oh, I don't want to hold it on my balance sheet. How about I rent it from the hyperscalers? And the cost for that is 10,000 on a per GPU per year basis. And so that will be $500 million on a per year basis. And as we move to the version of the model that will be in training in 2025 or 2026, I think that training cost is going to be $5 to $10 billion. And you are already seeing XAI building this 100,000 H100 cluster. And that in itself is a $4 billion total investment. And again, if you run it from the cloud, that'll be $2 billion per year. And I think like Jensen was already talking about 1 million GPUs connected together for training. And that's easily like a $50 billion, if not even more, of training costs that we are talking about. So those are very big numbers. And I think to your point, the implication or the good news from it is just very soon the long tail of model company will just like disappear. And I think the end state of the model companies will look very similar to something like the operating systems, where you have one or two oligopolies, and at the same time, you have something like Linux, which is open source.
Yeah, it seems like we're already sort of seeing that play out, right? Like
Yeah,
OpenAI is at a couple billion
exactly.
ARR,
Yeah,
Anthropic's at a couple hundred million, Cohere is at like 15 million ARR,
yeah,
as of a month or two ago.
right.
And Cohere is like arguably the number three. Now you have XAI, which totally changes the dynamic, but it's like the top two we're starting to run away with the lead already. Now XAI, given the amount of compute they have, will probably be in an interesting position. I'm curious though, on the open source or open weight side, there's like a counter argument to all of this, which is for a lot of applications, like you don't need a huge model. Like if you have an application that has like kind of a constrained, narrow set of use cases, maybe it's an application that only answers, a small subset of questions, doesn't have to have open-ended conversations, like doesn't need to be multimodal. You can get away with a much smaller model. Whether you take an open source model and fine tune that or train your own model on some proprietary data set. And the inference cost of these smaller models is likely going to be a lot lower than like the inference costs of GPT-5. And it seems like that's a case where the open weight models could end up like creating some dent in the opportunity set for the giant foundation models. I'm curious if you think that's a possibility, or if the capability set of the large models will just be so incredibly good that people will abandon using smaller models and trying to optimize for inference costs.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think definitely there will be some use cases that you simply do not need the best models to actually do that. And in that case, I think open source or open weight definitely has a place to go. And but the other thing is I never really think about the model companies as just having one model. I almost think about them as a model factory or like a model store. And of course, today they are going towards AGI, right? So they want to spend all the efforts into building the best and the largest models. But if you really think about it, it's probably very simple for them to actually create a 70 billion parameter model and or even like a 1 billion parameter model. And I think it's more likely that they can do it better versus some of the small model companies or the open source or open weight companies. And I think that's kind of the potential competition that I see from the larger model companies, even when they have the time and energy to focus on some of the smaller side.
That makes total sense. And we'll flip back to the CapEx question in a second. One of the concerns I think I have about the foundation model companies and also the hyperscalers is they're investing a ton of CapEx to create models that are really useful, and that will likely push forward, the rate of new technology adoption, the rate of AI adoption, because you have more capabilities, you can solve more problems. It will catalyze growth of the entire ecosystem, increase the TAM for technology industry or at large. Like all these great things will happen, but I think there is a risk that like they're unable to capture a lot of the economic value that's created. And I think like
Yeah,
an analogy that I like or have heard, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And if we go back to the Industrial Revolution, which I think has some parallels to where we are today, and you go back to the Industrial Revolution in England, there's an index of railroad stocks. And if you
mm,
would have invested in the index at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and sold at the end of the Industrial Revolution, you would have actually lost money, which is like insane given how much value was created in England in the Industrial Revolution. And the reason was twofold. First, these railroads were like very capex heavy projects where you
for
had
sure.
to raise a bunch of capital and build out the railroads. The second was they became super competitive, and so you'd have like three railroads running from point A to point B, and in order to compete, the operators were basically running them at a loss. And so if you spend $100 million like building a railroad and then you have to run it at a loss, like obviously it's not going to end well.
Right.
And then you had like consolidation, and that started to fix things. But I guess the argument that won't happen here is that there are really only like three hyperscalers that mattered. You could say, there's a fourth in there as well, and like given the sort of moat they've developed around the economies of scale with the data centers and all the capex spend there, but also like the moving up the stack and all the advantages of having the software on top of just the pure hardware. put them in a good competitive position. And now that it's been consolidated into a few players, like they'll have some level of pricing power. But I'm curious if that's a scenario you've thought through, and whether there are other reasons why that's not going to play out.
So I think this is really a multi-year investment cycle that we are actually going through. So I'm a financial analyst. I also tend to think about, oh, what is the unit economics and how much ROI can we generate in 12 months or 18 months? But I think that's probably not the right framework to think about this. So to your point, every time I receive a package from Amazon these days, I try to remind myself that that's only made possible with years of investment in sea freight, air freight, railway, and last mile deliveries. And the same thing goes for YouTube videos. That's only made possible with years of investment in high-speed internet or 5G. So in some way, I think about all the investment in AI today, similar to the investment in the information superhighway. I think that happened 25 to 30 years ago in America. And the total GDP back 25 years ago was $10 trillion. And I think the country spent 5 to 8% of the total GDP into the information superhighway. And versus today, total GDP is $25 trillion. And even 1% of that is $250 billion. So I'm just saying, in the grand scheme of things, I can sort of make sense of the hundreds of billions of dollars of GPU revenue that we're seeing from NVIDIA. But in terms of the return, I think too early to tell. But for example, like customer services is a $500 billion industry. And even if, say, AI can save 10% or even 20% of the cost, that's probably enough to justify all the CapEx that we already put into AI. Comparing maybe the investment cycle today versus, call it 20, 30 years ago, I want to say I think the environment we are in today is a lot healthier. So in the sense that, number one, in terms of the parties who are actually funding the CapEx, back 25, 30 years ago, I think those were the telcos who were the most aggressive. And those companies tend to be the most highly levered. And just a lot of those companies simply did not really make it in a higher interest rate environment. And versus today, we have the highest quality technology companies who are funding the CapEx. And they can afford to be more patient with their capital invested. And the other thing is 20, 30 years ago, you actually had companies called maybe Pass.com or eToys.com. Those were valued at 500 times revenue multiples. And we definitely do not have that today, or at least not yet, in the public market. So that relatively healthier capital market, I think, is also very important to make sure that we don't really run into a bubble.
That's a great point. And I totally agree about thinking about this on a longer investment cycle. I think people are probably some people are probably overestimating the impact of AI on like a 1 to 2 year time horizon, but massively underestimating the impact on like a 5 to 10 year time horizon. Like, one way I like to dimension this, depending on how you cut it, the global enterprise software market today is roughly $1 trillion. So companies spend about $1 trillion a year on enterprise software, but that same cohort of companies pays humans $32 trillion a year to do knowledge work, right? To write software
Right.
code, to review contracts, to design circuit boards, to do things that AI can increasingly do, not only a lot cheaper and a lot faster, but in many cases a lot better than humans, at least better than the bottom 90% of humans. And so if you get to a point where AI can do a task, you know, 5 times better and 10 times cheaper and faster than a human, like, of course you're going to use AI over the human. And
Right.
so it seems logical that as long as AI continues to progress, even if it progresses at a slower rate than it has historically, but as long as it continues to progress at some level, like in the next 5 to 10 years, AI is really going to start aggressively eating into that 32 trillion in labor spend, um, which means it's probably, in my opinion at least, going to create more net new enterprise value than the internet or mobile or cloud did in their super cycles. So I totally agree. Given the opportunity set in front of us, like $200 billion in CapEx is not as significant as I think people are making it out to be.
Yeah, exactly. I think people do the same math. They look at the total TAM, and at the same time, they look at scaling law. And then the scaling law continues, so the improvement continues. So they're like, oh, even though this is like $10 billion or even like $200 billion total CapEx, we just keep to continue investing into it because we have to capture the value.
Yeah, and I think on the railroad point that I made earlier,
Yeah.
I think that the fundamental difference is like the economies of scale component, which is both with the foundation model providers, where you'll have a few that are able to, invest billions of dollars in a training cycle and then generate, tens of billions of dollars in profit on top of that, where it'll be impossible for a new entrant to compete. But it's
Mm.
also true on the hyperscaler side, I think, as well, right? Given the amount of investment they've made in their infrastructure, building out data centers, all the software on top of the hardware stack that creates more value on their platform. So it seems like given that there are, two, three, four players and in both of those areas that really matter, it's unlikely that it'll be totally commoditized.
Right, for sure, for sure, for sure. I think it's also up to the model company. Do they just want to be an infrastructure company, or do they also want to be the product company? And I think increasingly it's very clear that they themselves want to be the product or the application themselves. So it's actually very similar to the operating system analogy that I think Karparsi first came out with. So he was saying, oh, the model companies, they are just like the new operating systems. And if you think about it, each new operating system actually comes with some default apps. Like in the case of Microsoft, for example, like the Windows comes with the browser as a default app. It doesn't mean that you cannot use the browser that you prefer to use, but I think it does mean if you are a browser startup, it's probably going to be relatively more difficult for you to be successful given the bundling nature of Windows go-to-market strategy when it comes to their default apps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And now that we're kind of shifting here, anyways, the application layer, uh, most people's experience with AI today is like ChatGPT, right? Where you're interacting with a model in sort of a open-ended chat conversation. And it seems like what comes very shortly after that, which is already here, is multimodal, where now the interaction can be through audio, through video, etc. Like we saw this in Google I/O's demo, and we saw this in the OpenAI demo recently. Um, and after that, we're going to start to see AI agents. Curious if you could walk through, like, how are you thinking about the agent opportunity? Like, what is an AI agent, and will that ultimately be owned by a small number of model companies, as we just suggested?
So, like, I think everyone is trying to make the agent work. And if you really ask me, I think the most likely winners are still going to be the large language model companies because, like, what exactly is an agent is the coding plus the reasoning capability that give you some kind of agentic behavior. So behind the agents, each move is basically a bunch of code, and they need to understand your intention. They need to be able to execute. And who has the most capability in terms of controlling that? It actually goes back to some of the large language model companies. I think they are also really pushing towards that.
I think that's going to be like the oh shit moment for a lot of people. I think a lot of people who are like maybe on the boundaries of the tech ecosystem who like use ChatGPT, like my parents
Right.
or people who aren't in the industry, like they understand what's happening, but also their interaction's kind of limited right now. It's like, oh, I have this
Right.
thing that I can chat with and it answers questions. I think when they start to see that like agents operating and the agentic behavior, like that's like going to be like the oh shit moment for people where they go, oh my god, this can do a lot more than I
Oh,
previously
totally. Yeah.
expected or understood.
Yeah. It's like not just talking to people, but also do things for me, which is
Yeah,
definitely a lot more valuable than that.
for sure. And obviously, what comes after that is AGI, which is one of the most talked about things on Twitter right now. I'm curious. One, how are you defining AGI? And
Right.
two, do you buy into the whole doom thesis that AI and AGI is going to overtake the world and destroy the economy and destroy humanity?
Right. So I think everybody talks about AGI. I was even asking ChatGPT, I was like, what is the definition of AGI? And I think ChatGPT versus Cloud versus Perplexity are just giving me very different answers. So there is actually no definition of AGI, which is kind of interesting. So I personally probably think about AGI as something like when the model or the AI can do 90% of the jobs better than call it 90% of the people. And I think how the market really think about AGI is like people really think that one day they wake up, let's say GPT 10 just finished training, and the model is so awesome, and they can unlock all the capabilities all at once. And that's the day we call AGI. But if you actually talk to people inside of OpenAI, they will tell you, oh, they actually call AGI as something that will have a slow takeoff, meaning that it's actually more progressive than all of a sudden. And I think Zuckerberg also said it in one of his interview really well. He said, oh, AGI is not just this one thing because there's no single threshold for humanity because people can have very different skills. So it's really like over time, it's more incrementally that we just add different capabilities to it. So how I think about it is very simple. Like, for example, for something like translation, maybe, we probably already hit AGI even today. Or for something like coding, as we just talked about, which is something that I can maybe see we get to AGI in 1 to 2 years. And there is a really long tail of different other skills that can be more complex and more nuanced. And that might take 5, if not 10 years for us to get there. And that's totally okay. So this is roughly how I think about a whole AGI thing.
I totally agree. I think the concept is kind of stupid. Like we're going to have like AGI within a domain, to your point, which we
Right.
already have in some domains. And like you don't need one model that's able to do, everything across every domain to have like a really meaningful impact on the economy. You just need models that are good at specific, domain specific tasks. And like
Right.
if you're good at coding and you're good at customer support and you're good at reviewing
Exactly.
contracts, doing legal work, like you're going to have an incredible impact on the economy.
Right.
So I think the whole premise of AGI is like maybe a little bit overdone. What about the second part of the question? Do you buy into the whole thesis that it's going to destroy humanity and destroy the economy?
I actually believe that maybe in the future that you and I probably don't need to work unless we choose to do the work. Because there will be one day that AI can do a lot of things for human. And I'm also personally very excited about the robotic opportunities. So, which means that AI can not only do some of the mental work for us, but can also do the physical part of the world. So yeah, I think it's very exciting to actually think that we can potentially one day have all the freedom to actually do what we really want to do.
I agree. I think it'll be a net positive for society, and like there will be bumps in the road, obviously, as there is with any disruptive cycle. But
Yeah.
I think if you look at the history of technology innovation, innovation has typically led to productivity growth, GDP growth, like higher quality of living. Like GDP growth was flat for like
Mm,
1,000 years in England, leading up to
right.
the basically flat, leading up to the Industrial Revolution. Then it massively accelerated, and quality of life across the board improved for most people. So it'll
Yeah.
probably be the same thing here, but
Right.
perhaps on
Right.
a even more meaningful scale.
And I think we also shouldn't really underestimate how creative human can be. So there are probably a lot of things that today, because we are really constrained, so we don't really have the time or the luxury, if you will, to actually think about it. But if say one day AI can do a lot of things for us, then I think human can be very creative in creating new domains. Yeah.
It's so interesting. If you go back to like the invention of the plow, um, you had hunter gatherer societies, and you look at say fast forward 500 years or even a couple hundred years from the invention of the plow, the societies who adopted the plow were the ones who ended up dominating, right? Both economically and militaristically, etc. And the hunter gatherer tribes basically just got wiped off the face of the earth. And the reason that was true is because if you're a hunter gatherer tribe or society, you spend almost 100% of your energy and time focused on survival, right? Focused on like finding food to eat, finding water to drink, etc. But if you have an agrarian society, you can have 1 or 2 or 5 people in your village farming, and the rest of the people can go build tools, right? They can go explore,
Exactly.
they can build weapons, they can do all these things beyond just like feeding themselves. And that's how you get productivity and leverage in a society.
Right. Right.
And it's kind of the same thing here to your point. It's like if we
Right.
have models that can automate a lot of the mundane work we do now, or instead of having 100 people do a mundane task, you can have one person, with an AI copilot. It frees those people to do other things that will create more productivity and value in society.
Yeah.
So it seems like
Exactly.
there will be bumps in the road, like there will be displacement in certain job categories, but net on like a 15, 20-year basis, like it'll probably be a very positive thing for society.
For sure, for sure. Like even at one point, I think 70% of the population was actually working in the farming industry. If you think about how that has really shifted over time and how much productivity gain or GDP growth we've been having in the meantime, I think that's very significant.
100% agree. Cool. So we've covered the energy bottlenecks. We've covered the position of the hyperscalers and the big model developers. We've covered the CapEx investments that they're making, some predictions about the future with AGI. Let's talk about like the next 5 years and the opportunities you're excited about as an investor. Where do you think there's going to be a lot of value creation that's going to be kind of net new and investable?
Right. Um, I think there are definitely a lot of very exciting opportunities, but maybe we talk about a few of the more debatable ones today. And I think one of those actually happen to be the model companies themselves. I've been very bullish on just investing in the model companies because I truly think the model itself is the application. And so far, there's just hasn't been any boundaries that we see from the model companies. And so I talk about the operating system analogy, which I personally really like. So I think what we do as investors, or how I think about it, is really to think about what will be the default apps for the new operating system, which is the model companies. And I think that leads to one of the more debatable investment opportunity, which is coding. For example, if you really ask people who are working at the model companies, they will tell you coding is everything they do is core to the capability of the model. And I think Llama 2 didn't really have modeling capabilities in it because Zuckerberg was saying, oh, I don't think people will be asking coding questions inside of Instagram or WhatsApp. And he's 100% right. But after they included coding in the model layer, I think they just realized the model became so much more rigorous and just so much more powerful. I think the mental framework is like coding can just lead to better reasoning. And with coding and reasoning combined together, you can get to some kind of agentic behavior, which is what everybody is trying to push towards. So if you really ask me today, I would say if I'm the model company, I'll probably have coding as one of the quote unquote default app. And I'll say the same thing goes for maybe the independent agent companies. And there's another one, which is what will happen to some of the vertical models, whether this is voice model or image model or video models. I think that's a true debate that we have in the market, which is that single modality good enough, or would the multimodality totally overshadow all the single modality companies? I think in terms of looking at the startup landscape, it's probably really easy and also extremely difficult today to be an AI startup. It is very easy because literally everything is just one API call away, right? But it's also extremely difficult because you don't really control what will actually happen in the future. You don't know how much better the next version of the model will become versus today's version. So you have to be pretty careful with your relationship with the model company. It could be today you are a standalone AI startup, and tomorrow you may just become a feature embedded in a model company.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think Sam Altman said this
Yeah,
recently, which was like, you can determine the fate of your startup, whether, if OpenAI or name any other foundation model announces that their model has a great new capability, like, do you get terrified or excited? If you get
right,
excited, you're probably going to be okay.
totally.
One of the areas that I think is interesting, and it's like sort of this like undefined uh, place in the spectrum between like private equity and venture, are companies that build like AI native. Let me rephrase that. I'm going to note to the editors to cut that out. Um, one of the areas that I think is really interesting is probably somewhere between like venture and private equity. But I think there's an opportunity in a lot of industries like accounting or manufacturing to build vertically integrated AI native companies to compete with the incumbents in that industry. So, for example, instead of trying to sell AI software to accounting firms who are probably like, owned by someone in their 60s who's been doing it for 30 years and like has 10 employees and it's not going to change their ways. Instead of doing that, like, why don't you just create an accounting firm that's AI native and like leverage the cutting edge technology,
Mm,
and you'll get the sort of tailwinds of as the technology improves, like your efficiency improves. And it's not a software business. It's not probably not a venture scale business, but like you can probably run an accounting firm at 50, 60% EBITDA margins if you're super efficient, like leveraging the frontier of what's possible in AI. I think it's true across a lot of industries, like manufacturing
Right.
as well.
Right.
A lot of
Exactly. I totally
manufacturers,
agree. Yeah.
yeah, a lot of manufacturers like these fragments at mom and pop shops that don't know what the cloud is. And
Right.
if you can build like a highly integrated AI native manufacturing company, you can probably dominate in a given category. So I think we
Right.
might see the emergence of these types of companies in the future, but I just don't know where they're going to fall on the spectrum. Seems like probably too tech oriented for a lot of private equity, and probably too like the upper bound is probably too limited for most venture. But I think for
Mhm.
founders, it's a kind of an interesting place to build.
Oh, definitely is. If you actually think about it in the accounting example you were talking about, it's probably easier to just build a new startup versus for an existing accounting firm to really pivot and go through a ton of organizational changes to get to AI. So yeah, in that sense, yeah, it's very interesting and very exciting to see how that will play out in some of the
Agree.
verticals. Yeah.
Agree. I think we're starting to see some of these companies pop up. So we'll see where they land in 3 to 5 years. But that's an example where you're very excited when models get better, not terrified
Right.
because
Right.
you're capturing the benefit.
Yeah. It's the verticals. Yeah. I think the model
Exactly.
just like they won't be getting into a lot of vertical industry. So you definitely have that kind of benefits.
Absolutely. And if people want to follow you, you have a great Twitter account. What's your Twitter handle and where else can they go to find you?
My name, Freda Duan. And then you can just find it on Twitter.
Awesome. And we'll link you to it.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so
Perfect.
much.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much
Perfect.
for joining.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Autopilot podcast. If you're using AI to create or disrupt a large industry, I would love to learn more about your story. Drop me a line on Twitter or go to our website, apv.vc. If you want to support the show, the best ways are to leave a review wherever you're listening and subscribe. The Autopilot podcast is part of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Moment of Zen, Turpentine VC, Age of Miracles, and more shows for experts by experts in tech.